In 1955, in a small farm outside Intercourse, Pennsylvania, a Lancaster County Amish grower, named by local agricultural extension records only as J. Stoltzfus, pulled 312 cucumbers from a single vertical tower that occupied less than 3 square feet of ground. The county extension agent who documented that visit wrote in his notes that the structure looked, and I am quoting directly from historical Mennonite community records, impossible by any standard of commercial reasoning. 2 years later, that same yield method had quietly disappeared from every major seed trade catalog in the northeastern United States. Not because it stopped working, because it worked too well. What you are about to learn in the next 20 minutes is not gardening theory. It is not a trick from a YouTube channel trying to sell you a course. It is a documented, multi-generational production method that Amish farming communities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, Holmes County, Ohio, and LaGrange County, Indiana have been practicing for over 200 years. A method that allows a single cucumber plant, properly trained and managed on a 3-foot vertical tower, to outproduce what most American backyard gardeners get from a full 30-foot row. And there is one question that sits at the center of this entire story. A question that will not be answered until the very end of this video, because the answer changes everything about how you see your own backyard. That question is this: if this method was documented, proven, and physically simple enough for any family to use, what exactly had to happen for it to disappear from every commercial catalog in America in less than 3 years? Hold that question, because before you understand what was buried, you need to understand what was actually there. And when you see the numbers, the real historical numbers from real Amish farms in real Pennsylvania counties, the quiet anger that comes up is entirely justified. Lancaster County in the early 1950s was not a postcard. It was a working production landscape. The Amish communities there, documented extensively by ethnographer John Hostetler in his landmark study, Amish Society, first published in 1963, had been refining intensive small-space production techniques since their ancestors arrived in Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. These were not hobbyist gardeners. These were families feeding themselves and their communities from plots of land that, by modern agricultural standards, should not have been able to produce what they produced. Hostetler documented farms where a single family raised the majority of its annual vegetable supply from under half an acre, including root cellars stocked so deep with preserved produce that some families entered spring with more food than they had started winter with. That is not folklore. That is documented field observation from a trained academic ethnographer. And the cucumber system was one of the most refined tools in that entire production tradition. Here is what the industry spent decades hoping you would never figure out about your own backyard. The average American gardener in 2025 plants cucumbers the way the seed industry taught them to plant cucumbers, which is to say, horizontally. A row, maybe 2. The vines sprawl across the ground, competing for light, trapping moisture under their leaves, producing fruit inconsistently because the plant's energy is distributed across 12 or 15 feet of horizontal vine that is half in shadow half the time. You get 20, maybe 30 cucumbers from a plant if you are attentive. You call that a good harvest, and the industry nods along because that is exactly the harvest they designed you to expect. The Amish tower system works on a principle that is as old as climbing plants themselves. A cucumber vine, given a vertical surface to climb, does not behave like a vine sprawling on the ground. It behaves like a production machine. When you train a cucumber plant upward on a trellis or tower, and you understand how to manage what farmers in Holmes County still call the lateral pruning sequence, the plant stops spending energy colonizing horizontal territory and redirects every unit of photosynthetic output into fruit production. Leaves get full sun on both sides. Air circulates freely. Fruit hangs straight, develops evenly, and signals the plant to keep producing instead of slowing down. The physics are simple. The biology is not complicated. The results are not subtle. A properly managed 3-foot Amish tower system, based on the lateral management techniques documented in the extension records of the 1950s and still practiced by growers in Holmes County, Ohio today, is capable of producing somewhere between 90 and 120 cucumbers per plant across a full growing season. That is not a typo. From 3 square feet of ground, compare that to the 20 to 30 cucumbers most American backyard gardeners report from their standard row planting, and you are looking at a yield difference of 4 to 5 times. From the same seed, from the same soil, from less space. If you have a garden, and you are tired of being told it can only produce a fraction of what it should, drop the number 47 inches the comments right now, Or better yet, tell us the state you are gardening in. Let's find out how many of us are out there, because based on what comes next in this video, there are a lot more people with underproducing backyards than the seed industry would ever want to count. The tower itself is not complicated architecture. Amish construction in Lancaster County has always followed what Donald Craybill, in The Riddle of Amish Culture, describes as a philosophy of functional sufficiency. Nothing more than the task requires, nothing less than the task demands. The traditional cucumber tower in Lancaster County was built from whatever upright material was available: cedar posts, locust stakes, even salvaged barnwood, supporting a series of horizontal crosspieces wrapped with rough twine or thin willow withes at intervals of about 8 to 10 inches. The whole structure stood roughly 3 feet tall and occupied a footprint of about 18 inches by 18 inches at the base. One plant per tower. One plant that, by midsummer, had completely covered that structure in a curtain of leaves and hanging fruit so dense that an experienced Amish grower could harvest it every 3 days without ever seeing bare vine. The key to the entire system, the part that the commercial seed industry most successfully managed to bury when hybrid cucumber varieties started dominating the market after 1955, was not the structure. The structure was just wood and string. The key was the lateral pruning sequence. Here is where the historical record gets uncomfortable for some very powerful companies. A cucumber plant, left to its own devices, produces what are called lateral shoots, secondary branches that grow from the junction between the main stem and each leaf node. In a horizontal row, those laterals sprawl outward and upward randomly. The plant does not know it is in a garden. It knows only that it is competing for light and territory. Those laterals produce leaves first, flowers second, and fruit third, which means in a standard sprawling vine, you are waiting a long time for each lateral to cycle through vegetative growth before it contributes fruit. In the traditional Amish tower management system, documented growers in Lancaster County used a specific lateral discipline that kept the main stem climbing vertically while directing first and second generation laterals into controlled short fruiting positions. The result was a plant with one upward climbing central stem and a sequence of short, loaded, fruiting arms fanning out from it at intervals, each arm producing 2 to 4 cucumbers simultaneously before being cut back to redirect energy upward. The tower never ran out of productive new growth because the pruning sequence was always one step ahead of the plant's natural sprawl tendency. This technique did not require a chemistry degree. It required a pair of scissors, some rough twine, about 10 minutes every 3 or 4 days, and knowledge that the commercial seed industry had a very specific reason to make sure you never acquired. By 1955, the American seed trade was undergoing a transformation that most backyard gardeners have never fully understood. The introduction of F1 hybrid vegetable varieties, which had been accelerating since the 1940s, was changing the economics of seed selling in a fundamental way. Open-pollinated heirloom varieties, the kind that Amish communities in Lancaster and Holmes County had been selecting, saving and improving for generations, produced seed that gardeners could save and replant year after year. A family that mastered an open-pollinated cucumber variety, including the lateral management technique that maximized its yield, never needed to buy cucumber seed again. F1 hybrids, by contrast, produced sterile or significantly degraded seed that could not be reliably replanted. Every season required a new seed purchase. The business model wrote itself. But the part they really did not want you to know about comes with what happened to the high-yield heirloom cucumber varieties specifically. The open-pollinated cucumber varieties that Amish growers had been selecting in Lancaster County since the mid-1800s were not the same cucumbers in commercial catalogs. They had been bred over generations for vertical production, for concentrated fruit set, for the kind of lateral fruiting response that the tower system was designed to exploit. Those characteristics were the product of 2 centuries of careful seed selection by communities who needed maximum food from minimum ground. They were, by any modern agronomic measure, extraordinary production plants, and they were completely incompatible with the horizontal row planting, mechanical harvest, and standardized fruit size requirements that were beginning to dominate commercial cucumber production in the mid-1950s as California growers started consolidating the national vegetable supply. According to industry history, California had by 1960 become the dominant source of commercial cucumbers for the eastern United States, a shift that had been building since the early 1950s as refrigerated trucking and the interstate highway system made long-distance fresh vegetable distribution economically viable for the first time. Small space, high-yield, backyard production was not just irrelevant to that business model, it was a competitive threat to it. Every family that produced 100 cucumbers from a 3-foot tower in their backyard was a family that did not buy cucumbers at the grocery store from September through October. Scale that across 10 million backyard gardens, and you are looking at a market impact that the emerging produce industry had very strong incentives to discourage. And discourage it, they did, not through law or overt action, but through the slower, more effective mechanism of catalog erasure and cultural replacement. The seed trade catalogs of the 1940s still carried detailed instructions for vertical cucumber production and included heirloom varieties specifically noted for their performance on trellis systems. By the late 1950s, those instructions had quietly disappeared from the major national catalogs. The varieties themselves were reclassified, consolidated, or simply dropped. What replaced them were hybrid varieties bred for horizontal row production, uniform fruit size, and the kind of disease tolerance that mattered when you were growing 10 acres of cucumbers in California's Central Valley, not when you were growing one plant on a tower in a Pennsylvania backyard. The needs of the industrial grower rewrote the vocabulary of the home seed catalog, and most American gardeners never noticed the switch because they were busy being told that modern varieties were an improvement. If you haven't subscribed yet, take a moment to do it now. Every week, this channel uncovers techniques like this one. The methods the industry quietly retired, the yields the Amish still get from plots of land that should not be able to produce what they produce, the abundance that the average American backyard could generate but doesn't because nobody told you it was possible. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the rest of this story goes somewhere that changes the math on your entire garden. There is a 73-year-old Amish grower in Holmes County, Ohio, who has never, in his entire life, bought a cucumber from a store. Not once. His grandfather did not buy cucumbers from a store either, and his grandfather's grandfather before that did not buy them either. On a plot of land behind his house that measures roughly 15 feet by 20 feet, this grower produces, according to neighbors and community members who have visited his property, enough cucumbers across a growing season to supply his household fresh, supply his extended family, and still put up dozens of quarts of pickles for winter. He uses the same tower structure his father built. He uses the same seed his great-grandmother saved. He uses the lateral pruning sequence that his family has practiced for more than a century without ever giving it a name, because in his community, it is simply the way cucumbers grow. He is not doing anything radical. He is not doing anything that requires special tools, special knowledge, or special conditions. He is doing exactly what communities in Lancaster County, Holmes County, and LaGrange County, Indiana, have been doing for over 200 years, which is producing extraordinary amounts of food from ordinary amounts of ground, using techniques that the rest of America was quietly talked out of between 1950 and 1975. Now, here's the question you should be asking yourself, and it is the same question your grandfather might have asked if he had lived to see what happened to the American home garden between 1955 and 1985. How did a country that in 1943 had over 20 million victory gardens, producing an estimated 40% of all vegetables consumed in the United States, end up, by 1975, with a generation of backyard gardeners who expected nothing more from their plots than a basket of tomatoes and a handful of beans? The answer is not complicated. It is not a single event, or a single company, or a single law. But there are specific, documented moments where the direction changed. The Victory Garden program ended officially after 1946. The federal government had encouraged home food production during the war as a matter of national necessity. When the war ended, that encouragement ended with it. What replaced it, gradually, through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, was a cultural shift toward the supermarket as the emblem of American prosperity. The grocery store was progress. The backyard garden was the past, something your grandparents had done because they had no other choice. The new American was a consumer, not a producer, and the post-war advertising culture invested heavily in making that identity feel not just normal, but aspirational. Then in the 1970s, Earl Butz, Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon and Ford, delivered the industrial agriculture philosophy its most famous summary with his directive to American farmers to get big or get out. Butz was not talking about backyard gardeners. He was talking about commercial farms. But the cultural message that trickled down was the same. Small-scale production was inefficient, outdated, and economically irrational. You needed scale to matter. You needed acreage to produce. A 3-foot tower with one cucumber plant was not serious food production. It was a hobby, and hobbies did not feed families. The Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970 codified what the seed industry had been practicing informally since the 1950s. It established intellectual property protections for new plant varieties, which gave commercial seed developers a legal framework to control the production and sale of seeds in ways that had never existed before. Combined with the already accelerating shift toward F1 hybrid varieties whose seeds gardeners could not reliably save, the PVPA effectively began the process of disconnecting American gardeners from the seed-saving tradition that had made home production economically self-sustaining for 200 years. You were no longer a steward of your own seed supply. You were a customer. And the Amish, who by religious and cultural principle maintained their separation from commercial dependency, simply kept doing what they had always done. They saved their seed. They maintained their heirloom varieties. They kept practicing the lateral management system on their cucumber towers because nobody in their community had any reason to stop. Now you arrive at the answer to the question this video opened with. What exactly had to happen for the Amish cucumber tower method to disappear from every commercial catalog in America in less than 3 years after 1955? Nothing dramatic. That is the answer. Nothing dramatic had to happen at all. No law was passed banning the method. No company issued a directive to suppress it. What had to happen was simply that the commercial seed industry shifted its entire catalog toward varieties that were incompatible with the method, that the cultural messaging around American food production shifted toward consumption and away from production, that the federal government stopped actively encouraging home food yield, and that an entire generation of American gardeners was handed new seed packets with new planting instructions that, conveniently, produced results just modest enough to make the grocery store seem necessary. The tower did not get banned, it got forgotten. And there is a meaningful difference between those two things, because one requires a conspiracy and the other requires only an industry pursuing its own interests while nobody was watching the door on the other side. What the Amish communities of Lancaster County, Holmes County, and LaGrange County preserved through all of it was not just a technique, it was a proof of concept. A demonstration, maintained without interruption across 2 centuries, that a backyard of ordinary American dimensions, managed with ordinary tools and ordinary attention, according to principles developed before the age of chemical inputs and hybrid seed catalogs, can produce an extraordinary quantity of food. Not just cucumbers. The same philosophy of concentrated vertical production, intensive spacing, and generational seed selection that produces 120 cucumbers from 3 square feet applies across the entire Amish kitchen garden system. That is not nostalgia. That is engineering. Low-tech, high-output, zero-dependency engineering that your grandfather understood and that the industry worked very efficiently to make you forget. Think about that number for a moment. 20 million victory gardens in 1943, producing 40% of the nation's vegetables. A 3-foot tower producing what a 30-foot row cannot match. A 73-year-old man in Holmes County who has never bought a cucumber in his life. Now look at your backyard, whatever you have, a few raised beds, a strip along the fence, a corner nobody is using, and ask yourself not what you have been told it can produce, but what it might actually produce if the techniques that made it possible had not been quietly retired from the national conversation sometime between 1955 and 1975. The Amish did not lose that knowledge. They never had any reason to. The rest of America did lose it, not because it was taken by force, but because it was replaced, slowly and methodically, by a system that was much more profitable when you believed your backyard was only capable of a basket of tomatoes. That belief was never true. And your grandfather, somewhere in the back of whatever memory you carry of watching him work, probably knew it. Leave a comment below and tell us what your grandfather grew in his garden, or the biggest harvest you remember from a time when your family still produced its own food. We read every single one, and the answers we get are some of the most striking evidence of just how much productive knowledge one generation can lose. If this video opened your eyes to what your backyard is actually capable of, give it a like, and share it with someone who is still gardening the way the seed catalog told them to, because the catalog left out the most important part. That is the part we are here to put back.